Well, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you're dialing in from today. It's fantastic to be here and welcome to our webinar series with Illumina. Today's session is Wargaming to Gameday. It's my absolute pleasure to be working with you today on this webinar. My name's Marcus Vaughan. I'm the co-founder of Illumina. Have been working in the resilience industry for 15, 16 years now. Absolutely passionate about building engagement in resilience and business agility across organizations. And this is, I'm very excited today. This is probably the most excited I've been about a webinar for certainly this year. And I would say this might be the most excited I've been about a webinar for the last couple of years running. We have a fantastic session lined up today. And before I introduce our guests that are here with us today, I'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping. So we have an hour-long format for this particular webinar. We're going to be doing a deep dive into some really interesting content around cultivating excellence with Darryl Cross and Andrew Allett, who I'll introduce in just a moment. So we're going to jump into quite a bit of content to start the session off for about 15, 20 minutes. Then we're going to walk through quite a curated conversation around this and how it applies to the business world in which we're all operating. And really allow that discussion to open up. If you've ever attended an Illumina webinar before, you'll find they are quite open and conversational on that front, really to draw out those lessons learned and experience from the panelists. We do have the webinar chat function open as well. We have left about 10 to 15 minutes at the back end of this session for Q&A. Please do get engaged in the chat channel. If you have questions, please log them there. I'm going to keep an eye on that. So by the time we get to the end of the session, we'll walk through as many questions as we can possibly get through, closing at the top of the hour. Just to cover off from a housekeeping perspective, as always, we will be recording this session. And so we will make that available afterwards as well. So you can obviously relive all of your favorite moments later, which is fantastic. But without further ado, I might introduce the panelists that we have on today. As I mentioned before, I'm very excited about this. I've introduced myself, but to join me with today, we've got Darryl Cross. Darryl is an internationally known expert on high performance and sales and continuous growth. His experience includes the head of sales skills and methodology, global strategy for Amazon Web Services, vice president of performance development and coaching at LexisNexis, and is also the founder of Hyper Teams and High Performance Consultancy. Darryl currently serves as a US executive sales coach for one of the top law firms in the world, Norton Rose Fulbright. Darryl, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, Marcus.
No, fantastic to have you on today. Also joining with us today is Andrew Allett. I'm very excited to be able to finally be on screen with Andrew Allett at the same time as well. We've been trying to find this opportunity for some time. Andrew Allett is a distinguished executive with 17 years experience in leadership roles across 8 diverse industries. Is an accomplished entrepreneur, board member, senior global security leader. Andrew has demonstrated the prowess in navigating complex projects in high-pressure situations in Fortune 500, cabinet-level government, and private sector organizations. Andrew's passion for security, operations, risk management, business continuity, crisis management, cybersecurity has really enabled him to thrive in dynamic environments and build bridges where there are none, and even more importantly, repair those that may have been destroyed before. With a master's degree in management from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree in political science from Mount St. Mary's University, and over 30 specialized certifications in cyber, physical security, business continuity, crisis management, compliance, Andrew brings a very unique blend of skills and expertise that enables organizations to be safer, stronger, and more proactive. Andrew Allett, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Marcus. Excited to be here today with you and Darryl.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, to get started, I might start with you, Darryl. We have had the pleasure of reading the book, Cultivating Excellence, the Art, Science, and Grit of High Performance in Business. If you haven't read this book and you're online at the moment, just do yourself a favor and get this book as soon as you can possibly get it. Paula Fontana did me that favor and putting this in front of me and blew my mind the moment I picked it up and started reading it. Darryl, I'm really interested, perhaps as a starting point, you can take us through some of the research that you've done over the years and what you've learned in terms of cultivating that performance across, I guess, business environments, what you've learned through that research and the interviews that you've done across industry.
Sure, and thank you so much to everybody that's taking time to be here today. I've been in many of your shoes before of how do we prepare our organizations for best case and worst case scenarios, and I know it can be terribly frustrating at times when things that should be going well and you're trying to figure out why they're not quite going well. So that's really the part of this presentation I wanted to highlight is the what if something goes wrong. What is the way to prepare for these things? And even with the people that we already regard as elite performers, people that, we know have been well-educated, well-trained, they work hard, they put in the hours, but then the variance in performance is just something that we quite haven't figured out yet. And what we've had to do when we went out and researched the book was try to find that secret sauce of performers. We were looking at individual performers. What is the reason that some people win lots of Olympic medals and no Olympic medals, or fly fighter planes or don't fly fighter planes? And when we went through it, we actually were completely wrong about our hypothesis. We went in there looking for secret sauces for individuals, but it turns out it was the organizations and how they prepared individuals that turned above average performers into elite performers. And that was completely by surprise. And also, as a bit of an aside, the way this got started, I wrote this book with my father, which is a wonderful, wonderful project, by the way, with that. It was just a labor of love. But I asked him one day, I think it might have been on a porch and there might have been an alcoholic beverage involved. And I said, Dad, we have some of the most talented performers in the world. They all went to the same schools. They all work hard as crazy, but the variability of good and bad is just stunning. And so he asked me, he was a former fighter pilot and a aircraft carrier commander. And he asked me, well, how do you train people? And I told him our typical way of training people corporate. And he paused for a moment and he said, well, we don't do that. This is not how we train people, because the consequences are too high to take for granted that people got it. We've got to test them. We've got to coach them. We got to simulate. We got to see what if something goes wrong. And that was the beginning of the research. And so we went around and we talked to the commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, fighter pilots, Navy SEALs, NASA astronauts, professional athletes, surgeons, lawyers, business executives, and just talked to them about their process. And that really was the genesis of the research. And so these are the main things that we found out, that if you want to take even above average performers, much less elite, the fastest route to higher performance is how do we improve the realization on people? And I'll explain that in a little bit, but they have it in them. So how do we get every bit we can and then continue to raise that level of proficiency as we go? We can reinvent ourselves or we can do new things, but if we just get 95% out of our people instead of 94, and not because we work them harder, but because they get better in the same amount of hours or less, that's what we want, improve realization. So it's not productivity, it's not profitability, it's realization. Can they do everything they can do? And then one thing we also found was the reliance on someone else to help them get there, coaches, is critical to do that, because we all have our defaults and we all get comfortable, and performance atrophies, even more apparent for superstars. And if you look at your favorite athletes or favorite executives or whoever it is, if they don't keep on it, it goes away very quickly. Also found that using teams as a development tool. If you look at the 4x100 meter relay, the world record holders, the women's, the USA team 2012, if you multiply the fastest woman times 4, she's still slower than the 4 together. But it's because those 4 people actually specialize in each part of the race and they push each other. And that's one of the reasons they do it. And we see that also with all these other types of teams, astronauts, pilots, surgeons, whatever. It's team-based development and pushing each other that does it more than even managers. And then finally, there is a system to coach and develop and test elite performers. And it's more of a reflective method. We'll go into that in a little more detail in just a minute. But we can't coach and train elite performers like they're 5-year-olds playing soccer. They just don't take real well to that. So we're looking to squeeze out an extra 1% out of people that are already best in the world. How do we do that without wagging our finger at them or telling them they're not working hard enough? They're working hard. Okay, we need to push them a little bit more, but do it in the right way. So with wargaming and simulation or experiential learning, it's really learning through story living. And one of the biggest pushbacks we get with training we saw is, this isn't related to my job. Why am I taking time to do this? I have a job. Why? I don't have time. But when you go down to, let's say, NASA and the Houston Space Center, they spend 100 hours for every 1 hour they're going to be up in space. And they test every possible thing that could go wrong. When you see people in the military, if you've seen the movie Top Gun, what do they simulate there? They simulate going through the mission over and over and over again. They change the parameters. They change the rules, which doesn't seem fair, but that's how we prepare for these things. And we immerse people in this. And when we talk about wargaming, which we'll get to in a minute, what's the difference? That's when we throw the challenge of competition in there. And what we have found is that all these professions have extremely high consequences of failure, terminal consequences sometimes. You know, when you go to space, you come home or you do not. You go up in the sky and you land nicely or you do not. So the way they prepare people is very specific. So it was our hypothesis, and our thing that we assert is, we might not have the same consequences, but if that's the best way to train people when it really counts, why not emulate what they do? And that's really what that. Every last piece out of it so we get really, really good at it. And grit is just that Sisyphean task of just doing it over and over and over again, putting in the reps, deliberate practice, not just doing the same thing over and over again, but make it a little bit harder, a little bit harder. So art, science, and grit, we saw all of our great performers have to balance these things, but it's really hard to balance it by yourself. And so all of them said to us, rely on coaches, which for a lot of us, we were surprised at, because, oh, well, these people they know how they got there, just keep it on repeat and work hard. But we found they didn't. They really, really needed.
Daryl, just to pause for a moment. I think we're losing some audio at the moment with your microphone.
Very sorry about that.
There we go. Let's come back again. I think it's just dropping in and out at the moment.
Okay. Is this a little bit better?
That works.
Okay, very good. Thank you for letting me know. So I'm going to go back and start over. No, I'm just kidding. So these 3 keys to high performance resilience, art, science, and grit, also applies to the way we coach. So it's important to keep in mind that if you have people that have been trained, working hard, doing what they're supposed to, and they're not getting better, you probably actually don't have a performance problem. You have a coaching problem. And so we have to rely more on our managers or external coaches to be able to do that. Actually, internal coaches, I'm a bigger fan of developing those coaches, but really figuring out where coaching comes in. So the model that we see that is pretty standard across these different domains, whether it's space, pilot, this what model, and just to describe it quickly, reflection, fundamentals, situational planning, simulation, and war games being the ultimate end to that. And just to briefly talk about it, fundamentals constantly. You know, this is going to the golf course and doing 100 balls on the driving range. This is practicing archery. This is practicing the piano, whatever it is. The best performers, they do fundamentals all the time. I actually went to a training camp of a National Football League, American football, and watched them do training camp for 3 days. And the beginning of every practice, they spent 45 minutes walking through the entire playbook. Every practice, every time. And these are people that have been doing this for 20 years and are regarded as the best in the world, and they still do that kind of thing. So fundamentals all the time. And we figure out which fundamentals we need by actually looking at situational planning. So what are the 5 or 6 things that happen all the time that we need to be ready for? So in resilience training, it could be, well, if this happens, then typically this is the next thing to happen. So we know that. There's no reason not to prepare for that, right? And that defines for us, therefore, which fundamentals do we need to practice? So you really get your managers to think through, okay, here are the most likely, most probable scenarios. This has happened 20% of the time, so we should know that. We can't know everything, though, and that's why we actually turn to simulation. So simulation wargaming is to test us, to see how we apply these things in real life, but also to identify things that we didn't think of. So, for example, this is in the underwater buoyancy tank that's at NASA. They practice, changing the battery or just using a wrench. Because the problem is, in NASA terms, if you go into space and drop a wrench, well, it costs about $1 billion. Why is that? Because you got to send up another rocket with another wrench. However, they do keep more than one, I will say. But that's the way they do it. Yeah, they go into a tank and they use a ratchet wrench and do this for 3 hours. That's simulation. And then they change conditions. They lower their oxygen level. They make them do it faster or whatever it is, because we want to learn here and not out there. And then after that, we do reflection again. We ask the questions like, okay, what was supposed to happen? Why did that happen? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? And, how do we make it better next time? So that's that reflection. And the picture is very intentional. People don't quite see themselves the way maybe everybody else does. So I think it's important to keep in mind, that's why coaches are important. That's why simulation is important. They think they got it. They don't quite got it. And once they get a culture of doing this, it creates this culture of continuous improvement, that we are constantly measuring it. We're constantly seeing how good are they, how much can they do it in their sleep. And once they can do it in their sleep, well, we don't want them to become automated. Let's change the stakes a little bit. And that's how you raise proficiency over time. Because what we're trying to tap into with coaching, simulations, and wargaming is this functional reserve. When I mentioned the realization on people, this is what we're trying to do. 100% is their total capacity with training and all of that. And I really don't mean to say, let's see how much we can burn these people out. This is what they are actually capable of. And so they have this gap called the functional reserve. They're complacent, they have reservations, or maybe just fear of looking silly. And coaches and simulations shrink that functional reserve. So same people, same money, same time, better results. And that's really what simulation gets us to. And so an example of this that they use in the US military, this is actually a simulation here of a dunk tank. This is practicing what happens when your helicopter goes underwater. So they put these poor 18, 19-year-old recruits in this thing and strap them in, and hey, you get a bird's eye view here. And so as you can notice here, it goes in, they turn upside down. And these divers who have done this probably 1,000 times and also probably have the luxury of a air tank, they watch these people struggle and go through this. Now, you might notice on here, the equipment is on the roof. That's because they're upside down now. And you might not have noticed, but they're all wearing goggles that have been painted and blacked out, and they got to crawl their way out of there. And then the next time they do it, they block that entrance and they make them crawl out a window, which not everybody can fit through at once. So they do this over and over again to practice and become comfortable. And when you talk to these people that go through this and you ask them, hey, how long before this becomes easy? And they say, never. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to you every single time. But you can do it the hardest way at the same level. But the first time you did it, you could not. And that's progression. And that's what that. And so that's what these simulation war games do. And that's why we see it in aviation, special operators, firefighters, astronauts. They all use it this way. And they're all trying these different ways of doing it. So real quick, to define the difference between these. Simulations, this is how we do applications of new skills. And hey, let's see how you do. They're supposed to replicate job tasks. So if you have a resilience program or a standard operating procedure, how you do that, let's simulate it, the actual one. And you can throw in some twists and turns, but we're trying to do this either in a complete scenario from start to finish, or maybe even just pieces of the scenario. A war game is slightly different. That is where we use the simulation, but we have our own people playing the opposition, our competitors, or maybe the black hats trying to get in. So we're competing against each other. So it's not just this go through the motions. There's actually someone time to win. So we prepare for the big event that way, or do pressure testing on our strategy. We get to the end of it and go, oh, well, that went terribly. We got to fix that. So let's plan for that situation and work on our fundamentals, and then we'll simulate it again. So that's where that process goes over and over. And this are just some basic applications of it. You'll get a copy of these slides, but this can sound complicated, but it can be as simple as walking into someone's office, leaning in the door, starting a conversation, go, hey, how would you handle this? And instead of them saying, well, I might, go, no, let's do it for real. I'm going to be this person. You be that person. Let's go through it for 5 minutes, and you can start meetings this way. Start your meetings with a mini simulation. All right, how would we handle this? Break out into the 3-person breakout rooms and then come back and discuss it. Or we can do this at your existing events, your gatherings of staff, when we're about to launch a new product, when we're about to launch a new infrastructure, a new technology system, or even thinking about maybe what our competitors are doing. So these are the different ways that we do it. Some case studies of that I'll leave you with. The one we call the Kobiyashi Maru, for any of you Star Trek geeks out there like me, that's what this is. This is where we test people in a no-win situation. We give them a simulation that is impossible to win. Now, they don't know that in advance, but what happens is we see their defaults. I've done this with salespeople, and you do this for sales, and eventually they get flustered and they go, I'll give you a 30% discount. And okay, we're done. Let's discuss that. So we want to see where their default is, right? And the same thing with the technology infrastructure, a resiliency scenario. When we can't win, what's our default? And then that's the piece we work on. So this is really useful. The war game is where we get our own peers to play our competitors. You have to do a lot of research. And in my experience, most of the time, the people playing the competitors typically win because they're not hamstrung by your conventional wisdom or the way you always do it. They're looking for ways to poke holes in it. And if you really want to test how your systems are, hire yourself as a competitor. And then the third way to do it is make a little bit of a competition. Managed competition is very, very good at doing this. It's kind of an extension of the war game. We get teams together to handle the same issue in different ways. And then by the end of the exercise, you go, oh, team 2 had a great result here, but team 4 had a good result on this challenge. And then you just compile it all into a high performance casserole. And that's what becomes our policy. And then we train on it and simulate it and make it better and better. So that's how we do these things. So as just a takeaway and getting forward to our discussion, they've got to be immersive, realistic, difficult. There's got to be a chance to lose, but we don't make them so hard that they can't do it. We get them to a certain level, we get everybody on the same, and then we raise the proficiency expectation. It's a proficiency model. Just like if you're landing a plane, if you're flying a plane, everybody has to know how to land, right? That's the proficiency. And then we make it harder. And getting it into our heads that atrophy is expected. So we've got to keep moving because the finish line is always moving is what's expected. And then using technology teams and coaches to scale it. We can't just work on this one person at a time. And we use teams to have them reinforce each other's performance when the manager or the coach is not there or the simulation is not going on. So remember, we use these simulations and war games to learn in this environment and not in this environment. And that is the consistent message we heard no matter what domain we talk to. So I'll turn it back over to you, Marcus.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that's probably resonating with nearly everyone, if not everyone, in this audience right now in terms of getting it right in a simulated environment as opposed to in broader outer space. The one thing that hits me really hard, and it hit me really hard when I read the book, Daryl, is this concept around coaching. I guess as risk and resilience professionals across an organization, we always look at and, follow the mantra that, hey, risk and resilience is everyone's responsibility, which really puts, I guess, the resilience champion and practitioner very much in that frame of being a coach or the super coach across the organization to really elevate that level of performance and capability across the organization. So I'm really interested just to, I guess, touch on your experience in the research here around what's the difference? What makes up the difference between a good coach and an average coach? What are some of those attributes and experience that you've seen?
Yeah, the exercise I usually ask people to do in more of a workshop is imagine, just kind of picturing you have the best coach you've ever had, probably name them, how they dress, whatever, what they used to say, and the worst coach you ever had. You can probably say, oh yeah, that person was terrible, and you can remember them too. But an okay coach, no one remembers them. So coaches are impactful. You might as well be good at it. The biggest default that I see, or the biggest fault that I see, excuse me, is coaches mix up it's not training, it's not managing, it's not mentoring, it's coaching. And so if you ever find yourself when someone asks you for help or to get better as a coach, and you say, this is what you should do, this is what I used to do, whatever, that's reminiscing, that's training, that's all those things. But you ask them questions, they go, well, you've done this a few times. What's usually the most common thing that happens there? And by the way, the answer. You already know. That's why you're in charge. That's why you're the coach. But if you tell them, they won't dig it out. And they might not buy into it because they're just listening to the old man or the old woman telling them what to do. So coaching is extracting information from them and having them establish a path by questions. And you have to resist the urge of opining from on high. It's not the purpose of a coach. Now, if someone refuses to do these things, that's a whole nother story. But when you want them to get better and to progress, you have to resist the urge to tell them the answer and to train them and actually coach them.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to take a quick poll here because I'm really interested in this particular audience, because it does raise a really good question around our role in an organization. I'll launch a quick poll. If you have a second, just please do respond to this. How many have you had any formal training or professional development in the skill of coaching itself? I'm really interested to see how the audience is looking at that. Whilst we're going through that polling, Andrew, I want to flip to you. I mean, you live in the risk, resilience, the security world. You work across organizations with absolute scale. I mean, I'm interested in your experience and your insight here. Do you think the skills of coaching have been really well incorporated in our discipline? Or if I use that broad brush, resilience discipline as the approach there, what are your thoughts?
Not yet, to be honest. I think there's tremendous opportunity in this space to be able to empower the people around you, to be able to use empathy and lead by empathy. And what I mean by that is, folks a lot of times go into a role and they have an agenda, or they're told what their agenda is. And I want to change that mindset. I want to challenge that mindset. I think sometimes when you just jump right into something and you're not leading with empathy and really trying to understand what the person or the group of people or the executive audience is dealing with on a daily basis, what the tactical teams are dealing with on a daily basis, then you're just going to hit a roadblock. And being a coach means navigating by leading with empathy, with dignity and respect, going back to those basics. And I think we neglect to do that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, I'm going to pull up the poll there and just share the results. So let's have a quick look. Looks like 45% have had some professional development in the skill of coaching, which is fantastic. 54%, hey, that's a development opportunity right there. I always look at these things with, I guess, the lens of optimism, and 1% is currently underway. So already all over it. Maybe they've included this webinar as the as the starting point for that. I know I certainly have. I've got a lot of work to do. Just back onto this, the concept of coaching, Daryl, because there can be a stigma around the need for coaching or the need for training. I'm not good enough. What do you say? Why are you saying I need training or coaching? Like there's almost an ego element built into that. I mean, what's your take in terms of how to reposition that and reframe that to put that in a much more positive sense to essentially elevate the importance of coaching to get that high performance out?
Yeah, it's funny. It's very true. Sometimes one of the worst things people can hear is like somebody comes to your office and says, "Hey, we're going to get you a coach." It's like, oh no, what did I do? What's going on? Should I get a box? And changing the philosophy and the cultural way we look at coaching into something that, hey, we give this to our best performers. We do this for people that we want to move up a tier. All those, that has to come from the top. So there's communication that comes from it, but you have to actually demonstrate it. If your top people, your vice presidents, your CEO, your C-suite have coaches, people see that. I think it's important. You don't want coaching to be, remembering that old Christmas cartoon, some island of misfit toys that your coaches are all spending all their time with, because people will resist it. It should be for your elite performers, the people that right after a demonstrated success, you just won a big account. You just did this big training. You rolled out this infrastructure and successfully launched or protected us against an attack. Give them a coach right then, publicly. So it's a reward. So you change that mentality with it. I just want to comment one real quick thing. I saw in the chat pop up, stand-up comedy might be a good way to do this. You're absolutely right. And I think someone said that as a joke, no pun intended, but 100% true. I've gone through stand-up comedy training.
Is that right?
And when you have to craft words down to specific numbers of minutes and have a 100%, you only are worried about what the audience thinks, not what you think. It is great training for a coach. Absolutely. That empathy and having someone else's perspective is a key element of coaching. So yes, the stand-up technique is a very good one. Whoever mentioned it, you're right on.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. It's something that I have a lot of fear of having to go down that path. Well, again, another development opportunity. Daryl, I want to tap into deliberate practice. I mean, you talk about deliberate practice a lot in the game around really honing those skills and that capability. Can you drill into, I guess, deliberate practice a little bit more in terms of what are the absolute must-dos to get that right to drive performance?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on deliberate practice, and there's also a lot of people that, try to, knock it down a little bit. One of the big ones that it came out of, people started talking about it more. Malcolm Gladwell did that outliers to 10,000 hours rule, and people go, oh, that's not really true, and this and that. Well, it's the right kind of 10,000 hours. I jokingly put on LinkedIn this week that, if you do 10,000 hours of piano, but you practice chopsticks, you're not a concert pianist. You're just the world's most annoying piano player. So it's the type of practice. If you do scales, if you go more difficult pieces, if you do that and you progress, that's what deliberate practice really is. So it's a thoughtful process of now I can do this, so it's time to do that, something a little bit more challenging. It's when we get into these sleepwalking modes that all of a sudden we look up and it's 10 years later and we're an expert on Y2K policy and whoops, that's not very relevant anymore. So that's where deliberate practice comes in. And, people like Andrew, people like you, Marcus, and your company, I think that's the value of what you bring to the table. It's like, it's constantly challenging people to do the next thing that both of you are looking 6 months ahead and creating scenarios and simulations and activities that prepare them for what they haven't done yet versus playing chopsticks for 10 years. So when you look at deliberate practice, really think about if you can do this in your sleep, you're falling behind, right? Move on. And that's what deliberate practice really is for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly something we're spending a lot of time on with micro-simulation programs in terms of developing that arc and working out where people are, where they need to get to in terms of that level of capability and applying accordingly. Andrew, I want to throw this to you because, again, you're working I've worked across a lot of major organizations at the moment. We often hear, I don't have time for this, or I don't have time for deliberate practice. In your experience, what have you seen get the attention to get that motion working across not just a leadership team, but also across a stakeholder base to win those hearts and minds and essentially get that buy-in?
Oftentimes, I think we're not actively listening when the executive team is talking or when other stakeholders are talking, and we're not listening to their pain points.
Mm.
And I think sometimes we just need to get to know people first, and we need to listen where they're struggling and then craft something very small and deliberate around what their pain point is. And for me, I intentionally have those conversations with executive teams during month-over-month business reviews, where we're talking about KPIs and metrics and where we can improve, relating it back to business strategy, relating it back to the day-to-day elements that fit into that business strategy, and then crafting scenarios that are very, very short bursts of attention around that. And there's a lot of effectiveness that comes out of that, because you right off the bat say, I hear you, I'm listening, which is building trust, which is extremely critical across the board. And then you're trying to move the needle forward and tie that to business strategy, which is extremely important as well. And I think oftentimes, like, that relationship aspect is just completely missed, and you can't be deliberate and intentional about practicing if you haven't built trust as a foundational core element first. So, I mean, to me, showing a leader how you can be there to help and navigate uncharted waters that are just not familiar to an organization, or may have been repetitive pain points, which we don't want. But sometimes that comes up. You show the teams that you're there to be faster and better, to help lower costs, which is an enabler. It's a function of this discipline to be able to enable business, and you should be able to do that. And I think those aspects are really critical.
Yeah,
Andrew, I want to emphasize that as well. This is a people process. This is trust, empathy. You're asking people to be vulnerable. You're asking people to do things they've never done before in front of their peers. And if the perception is, this is just to trip me up, make me look silly, just grind me into the ground, it will not work. This is to make people a lot happier at their jobs, that they feel much more fulfilled, they're engaged, they are on a mission, and they should be craving these opportunities. But if you have bad coaching and bad leadership, and this is all about just squeezing less ounce out of them, it will not work. So do not even try. This makes them enjoy what they do more, proud of what they do, go home and brag to their partner about it. So this is a human activity, not one about high performance and growth mentality and something that you'd see in a Harvard Business Review. This is a people issue.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Daryl, sorry, Marcus. Daryl, just to piggyback on that a little bit for a second. Most know that, or some may not know, that I started my career as a firefighter. So when you were using that analogy in the slide deck, it's very familiar to me. It was weaved into my DNA as a practitioner, boots on the ground, like type of individual, that if I didn't practice and keep my skills up to date and understand the threats and hazards that could potentially prevent me from going home at the end of the day, that I was doing a disservice to myself, my team, and then also my family, right? So I say that because everything we're talking about, has to be weaved into the DNA of an organization. And when you practice being vulnerable, it's okay to be vulnerable in a practice environment. You're supposed to be vulnerable in a practice environment. I mean, that's how you stretch your capabilities as a leader, as a contributor to an organization. You get better by being vulnerable, and changing that cultural aspect is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, going to keep moving because we've got a huge amount to get through, and we're running rapidly out of time. A couple of things I really want to touch on very quickly. The Octane Hyper coaching model, Daryl, in particular. So I love this concept of start with the simulation. I think, in our industry and discipline, we start with probably about 12 to 18 months of plan development, planning, and then eventually we get around to doing some simulation work. In your book and your research, you jump straight into scrimmages and simulation. I'm really interested. Just drill down to, I guess, your thought process and your research and what's come out around the importance of doing that to build up that level of high performance.
Yeah, I think it's a deep into the pool moment when you do that, use simulation first, which some people go, wait a minute, you haven't taught us anything yet. But if all of a sudden you had a resilience event happen right now, you'd leave this webinar and go deal with it. Yeah. Right. I'm sorry to say we're entertaining, but we're not that entertaining. Right. So we'd have to go do it. So whether you're trained or not, you have to go deal with it. So I like to use simulations at the beginning is to set a baseline of, if you even think about it, like if you have a 5-year-old that plays soccer, football, if you're not in America, the first day of practice, what do? They put them out on the field, they throw a ball out there and they go, all right, let's see what they do. And you look around and go, oh, wow, that person's really fast. And ooh, yikes, we're gonna have to work on that one. But you see how they perform. And then you start doing the drills and the simulations along the way. But you start with a scrimmage. When you start that way, a simulation, a controlled simulation, it allows us to see what we need to work on. And then the next time we do a simulation, you see an instantaneous increase of skill, right? And then you can emphasize, oh, if you'd worked better in teams, this would have worked. Or if you'd done this, this would have worked. And then they do it the second time, they're instantly better. And they say, oh, give me more. Let's do a harder one. So that's why I started with that. It can be uncomfortable with that. I also would highly emphasize with any simulation, but especially in the beginning, put them in teams of 3. I actually call them performance pods. It's not fair to ask one person to do everything, and 2 people can convince each other not to do it. But 3 people, there's always someone asking for homework from the teacher. So put people in 3-person pods and run your scrimmages that way.
Fantastic. And Andrew, from your perspective, in terms of, I mean, you've been, scrimmages, simulations, nothing new to you. You've been doing this literally since you stepped into the professional workforce. I mean, from your experience, how do you see this working to get the most out of a simulated environment with teams at an organization that's maybe smaller, right, to something that's, with a lot of scale?
Couple things. So I'm a big fan of micro, bite-sized elements. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, we're here today and everything, but micro is super, super important because our attention spans are only so much at the end of the day. And folks only have so much time. And if you're a 1-person shop, which is often, dedicating an hour of time to and 8 hours of prep time toward an exercise is not repeatable. It's not scalable. And it may not be beneficial. So for me, bite size is the way to go. And Daryl hit on this earlier, and he kind of took my notes off my iPad somehow. But some of the most effective ways that I've seen simulations integrated into an organization is in the beginning of a meeting, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. Yeah. You are just having a very pointed discussion, something super simple. This happens. What is your role? Start with roles and responsibilities. This happens in this role. How do we communicate that out, and who do we communicate it to? Just as 2 high-level examples. The other piece is dedicating time to just walk by somebody's office or drop them an instant message chat and say, hey, can you hop on a call in a little bit? I see your schedule's free. I just want to walk through something, and then dump it in 5 to 10 minutes and say, hey, thanks for your time. Happy we did this. Have a good day, close it out. Those elements don't have to be planned out over a long period of time. So you're already condensing down your execution strategy on the exercise front. You don't have to have plans written ahead of time. I'm a big proponent of exercising with no plans, no process formally documented, because you're training like you're fighting. You're not going to have a 100-page playbook in front of you during an incident. You're going to have to react off of your muscle memory. So anyway, those are just some of the elements that I like to weave into my programs.
Yeah, and if you think about those little micro things, he's absolutely right, because I mean, look at most people wearing a Fitbit or a Garmin watch or an Apple Watch, and if it says time to get up and move, you stand up and start walking. I mean, it's no one's making you do it. This little nudge theory of these little things. So if you can deliver these mini simulations or scenarios to their phone, to their desktop, or whatever, use software to do it, this is how you reinforce things, and you make it just part of their day, and they don't even know they're doing it anymore. And it's not deceptive. It's things that they want to learn to get better. They just need a nudge every now and then to remind them.
Absolutely.
And I've worked in organizations where every single day you log onto your computer, you get a security tip, or you log into your computer and you have an HR prompt to fill out a survey that's anonymous. This is another integration piece on the tech side that in an organization can be integrated into the day-to-day. So you may get a prompt at a random time throughout the day to say, hey, here's the question. Can you type a quick response? And it's 30 to 45 seconds. You know, it could be a multiple choice element, but it gets their brain turning in the right direction. And that's how tech enablement can help in this space.
Absolutely. I love it. And I was gonna throw that. We've got question time, obviously, for the audience now. So if you have questions, please jump in the chat and drop them in. We'll cover off what we can. I'm going to be a bit cheeky and kick one off for you guys. But I'm interested in, you talked a little bit about reflective coaching, Daryl, and in the book, you talk about the fact that bad coaching is often worse than no coaching at all. Do you want to talk us through, just at a high level, I guess, that the importance of that reflective coaching, when you're building high performance in adults?
Sure. So reflective coaching is actually based on the model that, if anybody remembers from Psychology 101 classes, Carl Rogerian therapy, is client-centric therapy. But also it's the same method as Socratic questioning. So it works really well with lawyers, by the way. And then also what the military uses in the United States, after action reports, AARs, what happened, what was supposed to happen, what happened, why did that happen, how do we make it better next time? So we walk through that process with it. And like I said before, you have to ask the questions to get them to identify these things. We want to find alignment. We want to understand their issues. We want to evaluate options together to move forward, and then finally lead them to results, right? Come up with a plan that the coach and the person are committed to move forward. And you also have to do this with teams. But the biggest part about reflective coaching is really dragging the answer out of these people that are already experts. Let's use a sports example, and some people don't like sports, but it's the one I got on the top of my head. Usain Bolt, pretty good runner. But if you look at back there, talk to his coach, Glenn Mills. He said he was lazy. He had bad technique, and it wasn't until he started working on it all the time. Usain Bolt was very, very tall, not very usual for a sprinter. And when he came up too quickly, and his body acted like a sail, and it slowed him down. So they worked on that for about 4 years. And I think he won a couple medals. So, I mean, it's those little things about, if he had just told him, don't run so high, he wouldn't have done it. But it's that reflective coaching of, why are you slow at the start? Why do you think that is? I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm so tall. Yeah, it might be it, right? You know the answer, but you coach them by asking questions to get there. And as you go higher up the scale of performance tiers, that becomes more important. People are resistant to coaching where questions aren't involved, and treating them like the experts that they are.
Yeah, interesting. Andrew, from your perspective, I mean, I think about this in the world of, post-incident reviews and after-action reviews. I mean, talk me through your experience in terms of using those types of techniques. What's worked really well to really draw out those, those nuggets that take us to that next level?
It needs to be rapid, and it needs to be continuous. Like, remember those elements there, because that's going to guide what I'm about to say. So when you have constant stakeholder engagement before, during, after any sort of incident that pops up, that's going to be what drives you forward and allows you to build on that momentum. You only have a short amount of time to actually engage in the right way with the executive team, with the tactical level stakeholders after an incident. And I actually challenge folks during an incident, take a pause, 5 minutes, and just reflect. It's extremely important, especially with quickly escalating situations that border cyber and physical, and they're escalating really quickly, lives at stake, customers at stake. the list goes on and on, capabilities failing, you need to take a moment to kind of reset. And I think that goes into what Daryl was saying earlier in this coaching methodology in this space, because when you have somebody that can look out on the horizon and piece things together strategically and tactically, and then bring people together, see that different viewpoint, I think that's extremely helpful, especially in the after action review space, not just incident response, crisis response. I also see in the after action review space, tech as being a huge enabler. I think over the next couple of years, we're going to see a transition from really analog capture of after actions and lessons learned to more digitally capturing that. And I think that's going to happen, especially as our folks have to do more with less, and tech is going to scale down on price and scale up on capability. It's an opportunity to use tech for what tech's good at, and that's to augment the workforce and really help them out. So I see that happening quite a bit over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I'll throw that to you as well, Daryl. I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of technology enabling high performance in organizations? Have you had any experience with that, or any observations through research around really good use of technology to be that force multiplier?
Yeah, it's very important. Force multiplier as well as a results multiplier. It allows scale, and especially in the kind of environments we work on, global, hybrid, but the acceleration of threats that are out there. I mean, it's just, we can't do things in this analog way or linear one at a time. These things are happening exponentially at this point. So how do we use technology to constantly be challenging people and thinking forward, but at the same time, like I saw someone mention in the chat, avoiding notification fatigue and like, oh my goodness, yet another thing I have to do. So the more we can do to bake it into their day, like within our meetings, within our exercises, when we do a review of our policy or our emergency procedures, we insert simulations and practice into those things. It's not a separate event. So you really have to bake it in, I think, quite a bit. And technology becomes really important because it documents it, it can measure it. And as we get forward into like AI-driven solutions, it may start to create these solutions or these scenarios for us, and be able to interpret, well, Daryl's not very good at this, Andrew is better at this, so we're going to have different levels of challenges based on that. So technology and getting it in that foundational thing now and getting it as part of our habit and our infrastructure now, because as it advances, it's going to get so much better. And it is just the key to keeping pace or exceeding pace of what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll attest to the fact in terms of rolling out, micro simulations using Illumina, the data that we're gathering in terms of level of engagement and what we're seeing people hit and miss during micro simulations and we've got plenty more work to do to turn that data into a much smarter form of intelligence. But it's an amazing trend line that you can see automatically as we start integrating that into organizations. We are almost out of time. I saw one question now that I really want to jump on because it is a really important one for this audience. How do we get C-suite leaders to not only participate, but model the rest of the organization that this needs to be a priority? How do we get that buy-in to go top down and make this happen? I mean, Daryl, any thoughts from your side from experience?
Well, you go to their meetings. So if you can coerce your way into or persuade your way into, when's your next board meeting? We would love to run a simulation exercise of a PR failure or something, we lose our CFO or, something like that. The stock price crashes 20%. Get them believing in the technique, I think, of doing these simulations. And when these C-suites all sit around going, oh, wow, we don't know how to do this. We hadn't thought about this. It's like, yeah, we should probably be doing this all over the organization. So getting them to do something minor that way, I think, is really important. If you can't get that, and that's a bit on the unicorn and kumbaya side, I do understand that. Finding just a champion, the CFO, the COO, whatever it might be, just one of them. So can I run this with your staff? Can I do one of these things? I think that's important to do. You need a champion. You don't want these things to be known as useful but optional. It's tied to your strategic performance. The other thing you do is pick something, go, hey, we're launching a new product in 6 months. Can we run this technique on the new product? This approach or this new rollout of new software, not for the whole organization, but just this thing that you, Mr. or Mrs. C-suite, have a lot riding on. Test it with something that's important in the future.
Absolutely. Andrew, any perspectives from your side? You've been in the hot seat.
I would actually kind of flip it. And this could be a sequel at some point in time, but of course I see the value of engaging C-suite board level folks, and definitely agree with you, Daryl, to have the importance around having a champion. I would actually kind of flip that and say, if they don't want to be engaged, don't force it. And the reason I say that is because I would also challenge, like, if something hits the fan, whose responsibility is it to help guide that C-suite executive? Because at the end of the day, they're going to be looking to a team of people probably to help solve a complex challenge. And they're not going to have all the answers. They could be extremely disconnected from, all of the stuff that's going on because it's not at that level for whatever reason. So they may not be familiar with process and tech that can enable a response, or even the teams that are involved. So I would kind of just take a step back and say, what's the purpose of me engaging the C-suite and that level of leadership? And if you can clearly articulate that, then I'd go down Daryl's path of what he mentioned a couple minutes ago. If you can't, then take a step back and see who you need to engage with. That's kind of my perspective, just flipping it a little bit.
Yeah. To your point, find the champions, I think, again, right, in terms of building up that momentum. Okay, we are very much running out of time. So